Well, hey, AP. So, like I've discussed in class, we are going to have to do natural selection notes at home. Unfortunately, we've worked so hard. And so I really hope to go through questions with you in class and practice questions and concepts through question form. So taking notes is a way for us to save some time. And so thank you for doing this. I know, obviously it's an assignment, you don't have a choice, but I know you're doing your best, and that means a lot to me. So let's go ahead and go through first. This is lecture 1. So this is first off, let me share this notability. My bad. Let's have a little conversation here. So how are you doing? Hopefully you're keeping your mind about you, wits about you. All right, there we go. That's better. I think, maybe not. Okay, so here we go. So evolution, so yes, Unit 7 is all about evolution. And evolution is change in genetic makeup. Okay, so if alleles change, then that is by definition evolution, okay? And it's supported by multiple lines of evidences, which I'll talk to you about how, the Bible, creationism, and what Genesis says in class. Okay, so describe the cause of natural selection. So first off, describe the cause of natural selection. So we can see that it's a major mechanism of evolution. First off, natural selection, is based upon environment pressures, right? And so according to Darwin's theory of natural selection, competition for limited resources results in differential survival. Okay, so some individuals outcompete other individuals. Individuals with more favorable phenotypes are more likely to survive and reproduce. How did they get those favorable phenotypes? They got it through random chance, according to Darwinian evolution. Okay, and then they pass those traits on because it gave an advantage to surviving. Okay, fitness is measured by reproductive success. In biology, if you don't survive and reproduce, you have failed. Okay, so fitness is success based upon reproductive success. Biotic and abiotic environments, so living things in the environments and weather and non-living things can be more or less stable or fluctuating. And this affects the rate and direction of evolution. So, and we'll look at great case examples of that, like finch beak size and some lizards and all sorts of different things. So different genetic variations can be seen in each generation. Again, evolution is a change in genetic makeup. Describe the importance of phenotypic variation in a population. So phenotypes is what we physically see. So this could be an enzyme. This could be outward fur color, anything like that. Natural selection acts on phenotypic variations. Well, and that makes sense because, natural selection isn't going to select DNA, right? That's not what it's selecting. It's natural selection, if a hawk's looking at a mouse, it's just looking at its fur color and if it blends in or not. It's not looking at its genes. Environments change and apply selective pressures. Of course, lots of change happening, especially, like global change and global warming and temperature changes and all sorts of different things. And so some phenotypic variations significantly increase or decrease fitness, the ability to survive and reproduce. Okay, so before you start this lecture, I would take a pause and see if you can explain or summarize these 3 things. Explain how organisms inherit their traits from their parents. Summarize the flow of information from genes to proteins, so that's Unit 6, and explain how the scientific process works because, we're going to be dealing with a lot of examples in science, so, scientific method and all that. And so evolution is supported by scientific evidence, including math and DNA technology. So an example, Lepidopterans, or pterans, insects have many features in common. They also have many features that are distinct from each other in both in caterpillar and adult forms. For example, this is just an example of, the beauty of life. The adult deadleaf moth mimics a dead leaf, hence the name. But the caterpillar mimics a snake about to strike. Okay, and so these moths illustrate the fit between organisms and their environment. So that's what evolution is, right? We're not building a perfect organism. We're building an organism that is fit in its environment because nature selects for fitness. Shared characteristics, unity of life, right? Whenever you see unity of life, you need to think evolution, and the diversity of life, which comes from our genetic code. And so there's the deadleaf moth. Pretty crazy, huh? And here's a caterpillar. And again, this is all, based upon the environment. This moth does not have a fitness, in like green leaves, right? If the forest was covered with green leaves or no leaves, or if it was out in a prairie land, it doesn't have fitness, but it's based upon its environment. Okay, all based upon its environment. And so an example of this is also the flu, and this is technically the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu showed something pretty crazy, and this is excess mortality rate. And so, where did people get hit the hardest? And so young people got hit the hardest, right here, super young, and of course, always the elderly get hit pretty hard with things. But notice, the young, the prime of life, got hit harder than they normally do. And there, studies have been done about all that, and how did the immune response, how did it decrease, the ability to survive, and overreacted and all that sort of stuff. But it was something special, and a tragedy that occurred, inside of the Spanish flu epidemic and pandemic. And it was just really a hard thing to realize, man, in the prime of life, you got hit harder than anyone else. And so evolutionary theory develops better flu vaccines. We can use it to develop flu vaccines. So evolution is helpful, knowing about how things change and how living things change based upon helping us survive. So, the 1918 flu virus, of course, is not the same. And what happened is evolution. What happened was mutations. And of course, even the vaccines every year, they don't work 100% of the time because evolution is happening. An example would be lactase as well. Lactase is a great example of evolution. If you can drink milk, you are a mutant. And we might dive into that in class, okay? And so here's a brief biblical thought. This is based upon probably a young reading of a Young Earth kind of reading from a Young Earth site, but God created things according to its kind, right? But we can't deny that evolution happens. Evolution does happen. We've seen changes. We see changes. But can evolution possibly explain going from a single cell organism, to a human being? It's very hard for evolution to explain that. Very, very hard, because you have to have tons of meaningful information added. And so us being a Christian school and me being a follower of Christ, I, by faith, choose to believe that God created according to kinds. But within those kinds, there can be differences. But even within the Christian community, there's different readings and different, conversations happening as far as age of the earth and all that sort of stuff. And I would love to talk to you about that. I'm nowhere near an expert, but it's pretty cool. All right, so let's go into evolution. Evolution is a change in genetic composition of populations over time. It's observed. Here's the finches from the Galapagos that Darwin talked about. And so for now, we will define evolution as descent with modification. So we're talking about descendants, right? Our children and grandchildren. And so they accumulated differences from their ancestors, and eventually it led to a change. And again, all about genetic composition, right? That's what we're talking about, genetic composition. And so why is it important? Well, it can help us treat diseases. It can help us develop crops and industrial processes. You ever heard of pesticide resistance, and insects, and how crops can be prone to disease, right? And insects. Evolutionary theory can help us with all that. And of course, you understand the diversification of life. That's more of where did life come from? And by faith, we believe that God created. But, biologists of, secular thought believe that, all life came from a single living cell and then accumulated changes over billions of years. So evolution theory is not just a single hypothesis, right? It refers to a lot of different results and experiments and all sorts of different things. So here's good old Darwin, young man, and he went on a voyage of the HMS Beagle. And what he saw was that species change over time. He dug up many fossils. They share a common ancestor. And then the mechanism that produces this change is natural selection. Nature, based upon the environment, randomly weeding out the weak ones, okay? And so prior to Darwin, the view of nature was determined by deep-seated beliefs. Biologists have slowly begun to accept various ideas of evolution. Darwin actually had a misreading of Genesis. Darwin didn't correctly read Genesis. And so this led to his faulty understanding. He believed that God created fixed species, and that's not at all what Genesis says. Genesis says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then it goes through this story where some people even believe it's an analogy, but nonetheless, God being the creator is something you cannot argue away from a Christian standpoint. And so there's some guys that, maybe you should know about history-wise, like Linnaeus. He believed in the fixity of species. Again, that's a misreading of Genesis, but an ideal structure and function. He developed the binomial nomenclature, like our name, Homo sapiens. That all started with Linnaeus. Cuvier proposed catastrophism, which some people still argue, and there's a lot of debates. We don't have to get it, but maybe change happens as a result of catastrophes happening over time. Lamarck, good old Lamarckism, is he was the first biologist to propose evolution. He thought that inheritance of acquired characteristics, which means how you lived, determined what your children look like. Okay, and so Charles Lyell, most people in this time believe the earth was really young based upon tracing ancestry in the Bible and other reasons, although that is not a foolproof way to trace ancestry, because sometimes Bible authors skip generations and stuff like that. And so proposed uniformitarianism, which means the processes of change are constant, which means if continents are moving, 0.1 centimeters a year, and then you have Pangea, that's horrible. And, then that makes sense. It would take hundreds of thousands of years for things to happen if everything's moving the same. So here's Lamarck, right? And so early giraffes had short necks. Lamarck proposed that if you stretched your necks and elongated those muscles, right, you pass those traits on to your kids. So you're like, well, no, just because if I'm strong, right, if I build a lot of muscle, that doesn't mean my kids will automatically build muscle, right? But, right, we talked about epigenetics. And here's a book. It's not I guess this guy makes some genetic errors in it. I've never read it. I saw it, but it's about epigenetics, right? Epigenetics is this whole, this theory was supplanted by Darwin's theory, but Lamarck kind of described epigenetics, like how you live does affect your kids, and it is true. Epigenetics does teach that your choices do matter, and it can turn genes on or off. It doesn't change the genetic code, but it changes gene expression, which does change phenotype. Okay? And so here's Darwin as an old man, but this was his trip on the HMS Beagle, 5 years. 5 years. Died multiple times. Of course, the Galapagos is where a lot of his theories came to be. He liked some places, he hated others. Not going to go into all of that. He, along with Hutton and Lyell, which of course were kind of uniformitarianism people, he was able to see bio-life, geo-earth, biogeography. Darwin saw similar species in similar habitats. So natural selection works in similar ways, okay? He also saw living things could be descended from extinct forms. So the Glyptodon is like the ancient ancestor of armadillos. And he saw this huge one, and he dug it up, and it was crazy large. And he started putting all these thoughts together of okay, well, life comes from ancient living organisms, right? Sorry that this didn't go into knowability correctly. Darwin compared South American animals to those with which he was familiar. Instead of rabbits, he found the Patagonian hare in the grasslands of South America. Similar, but not exact, right? So were they adapted to the same environment? Both animals ate grass, hid in bushes, moved rapidly. And so he's kind of thinking about these questions like the ostrich and the rhea, the emu. Why do they look so similar? One of the greatest places he went was the Galapagos Islands. And we'll watch a video about them hopefully in class. In Galapagos Islands, he noticed that the tortoise neck varied from length to length from the island. And of course, these islands are very, different when it comes to vegetation. And so he proposed that speciation, which is the origin of new species. We'll talk about that, in a lecture down the road. Correlated with a difference in vegetation, right? And so the Hood Island one, the vegetation's high. And so on Isabella, there's plenty of vegetation, plenty of food. So what led to the large dome-shaped shell? Well, it was for protection then. If food's plentiful, that's not a limiting factor. That's not a selecting factor. Now it's protection, right? He even saw differences in finches, which I'll definitely show you a video of about the Grant's research. And Darwin observed many different species of finches on various islands. And the variety of beaks had descended from what kind of food did they eat and what food was plentiful on the islands. And you'll see evolution in these videos I'm going to show you. You'll see evolution happen in years following droughts or monsoons. Okay, again, evolution, change in genetic composition. The pepper moth story from, way hard to see that one, right? I mean, I can't even highlight correctly. Way hard to see that one, right? Well, the trees in England started to be covered with black soot during the Industrial Revolution. And so these allele frequencies changed. And you're like, well, the moth is still a moth. Yes, but by definition, evolution did occur because genetic composition changed. And we've seen this in lava, rock-covered places with different species of rodents and how over time, right, over time you have more dark-colored rodents, dark fur, black fur, compared to tan fur. And you're like, well, yeah, but you still have a rodent, but that's not the point. The point is that is evolution. That is a change in allele frequencies and genetic composition. Darwin perceived adaptation to the environment and the origin of new species as closely related processes. So being able to adapt, which means, of course, comes from your genes, to the environment and the origin of new species, right? And so we'll talk about that. I'm not going to dive into that now. Were related. Of course, for evolution to exist, you have to have speciation. You have to have, okay, we came from species A, and now we have species, B and C, and A is our common ancestor. Okay, we'll talk about that down the road. And so here's the different, finches on the Galapagos. You have your cactus eater with the long, sharp beak, being able to tear cactus flowers. You have the seed eater, large beak adapted for cracking seeds. Insect eater, narrow pointed beak to grasp insects like pinchers, right? Again, and these are different species of finch, but have all these finches been there forever? Well, doubtful, right? Probably there's a lineage of finches, and then they develop different characteristics and stop mating, and then developed into different species. Okay, he wrote an essay on natural selection. It's actually an interesting story. A guy named Wallace was also kind of working on his own theory. Wallace does get credit for many different things, but Darwin came up with it first. Natural selection is a process in which you should always know the definition of huge terms, and natural selection is one of those terms you need to know. Natural selection is a process in which individuals with favorable inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. So this is kind of how it works. You need to be able to explain this out loud. Individuals with certain heritable traits, certain heritable, right? Heritable, the key, passed down, genes. Also think epigenetics, right? That is also passed down, which is crazy to think about. Sorry, that's horrible handwriting. Survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. Over time, natural selection increases the frequency of adaptations that are favorable. Fitness. If an environment changes, natural selection may result in adaptation to new conditions, sometimes giving rise to new species. Okay, we're talking about fitness here. Okay, so again, members of the population have variation. More individuals are produced than can survive, so therefore they compete to live, for space, for food, for mates. Some individuals have advantages, favorable traits, such as like drinking milk for our ancient ancestors, increased in survival and reproduction. And so they succeeded in passing those genes on. Natural selection then chose those populations adapted to the local environment, and that's adaptation. So the living things adapted. In increasing proportion, succeeding generations will have those favorable characteristics. Why? Because you're more likely to survive and reproduce. You can see a lot of variation in skin color. Skin color is based upon evolution. So Darwin emphasized that individuals from a population vary in their functional, physical, and behavioral characteristics, and these variations occur randomly. Yes, there is no God in evolution, in Darwin's theory of evolution. Everything is random chance. Nothing is lasting significance, right? If you don't survive and reproduce, you have failed, and everything ends with your death. There is no afterlife. He proposed that these variations are essential to natural selection. Yeah, if you don't have any variation, what can you select on? So you have to have variation, and then allow adaptation to the environment over time. Okay, so fitness is reproductive success. The most fit individuals will outcompete and pass those genes on. And that could lead to adaptation, which is change that helps the species become more suited to its, notice the key word, environment. Okay. Darwin, how did he kind of come up with this stuff? He understood something about artificial selection, which is when breeders choose which traits to perpetuate and select. And so dogs, descend from the great wolf 14,000 years ago. The process of diversification led to extreme phenotypic differences. Look at this. Boston Terrier versus the Irish Wolfhound. That's insane differences, right? But Darwin also knew this, that all these vegetables right here, the cauliflower and the broccoli, and, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi. I've never had it, but I see it used on Food Network every now and then. They all come from an common ancestor, the wild mustard plant. But what did you have? You had people suppressing flower development, enlargement of leaves. They started selecting for traits. And look at all the genetic possibility inside of a wild mustard plant, right? And so when you start selecting for something and you give thousands of years to it, you can start developing crops that differ in each other, okay? Darwin knew this because he bred pigeons. All of these pigeons right here, 1, 2, 3, they all come from selecting breeding from the rock pigeon. You would think those are all different birds, right? Come on now, right? Look at that. Where's the even head on that one, right? And so laboratory experiments also demonstrate genetic variation and genetic possibility of variation in populations. Selection for certain traits in the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, again, that's a model organism, resulted in new combinations of genes that were not present in the original population. So here's the original population. What they did was that they selected for high number of bristles on the abdomen, and they selected for low number of bristles. And over time, And over time, you see how there's no overlap? That's natural selection. That's artificial selection, but that's evolution, okay? So here's the blank, summing it all up. You pause the screen and do it, okay? And then Darwin's natural selection hypothesis is based on observation that he saw. He saw these finches, he saw all these things, and now we have DNA to help us and laboratory experiments to help us and all of that. This is a video I'm going to show you about the grants. It's a famous example of evolution on the Galapagos Island when it comes to finches and Daphne major, one of the islands. And so I'm going to show you that video in class. Okay? All right, so this is lecture 1. We're going to make it, guys. We're going to make it. Lord willing, we're going to make it. And in Jesus' name, please help us, Lord. We need you. Thank you so much, guys. Much love.